One of the most, I'd say, satisfying parts of economics, which doesn't get as much attention as it should, is labor economics. Obviously it's important. Most of us work for a living, or at least pretend to work for a living. But also it is a field, a subfield that is, if you might say, more scientific than almost anything else in economics. It's really evidence-based. You've had multiple revelations where the data have actually changed the way people, myself included, have thought about stuff. And among the most effective, prominent practitioners of modern labor economics is Arindrajit Dube, who has a new book called The Wage Standard, which we'll want to talk about, but also in general about labor economics. And I thought, take a break from all of the other stuff going on and talk about Aaron's work. So hi, Aaron.
Paul, nice to see you.
Yeah. So, welcome to my virtual studio. And why don't you talk just a little bit about the wage standard and what you're trying to do, and then we can get into the broader labor economics issues.
Yeah. So, I wrote a book. Here it
Which, by
is.
the way, we don't mostly do in economics. We write,
Exactly. Now,
5,000 word articles. So yeah.
Paul, of course, has written many amazing books, but economists don't usually write books because we publish articles. That's right. And so it was actually a big deal for me to sort of think about, did I want to write a book? And I kind of went for a number of years, and I said, like, oh, well, I'm not writing this book for other economists for as a main audience, though of course I'm very happy for other economists to read it. But I wanted to try to have a broader conversation, and I needed to be clear that I wanted to know what I was going to say in that conversation. And so here's basically the main point of the book. The main argument is that Americans deserve a raise, that most American workers actually could get paid more and should get paid more. And there are really good reasons to think that, the market has not delivered what could be a sustainable but higher wage for those in the bottom and lower part of the income distribution. So that's basically the core idea. And I try to bring in what we know about the research that I think has really, really blossomed in the last, decade or two decades on a bunch of topics when it comes to understanding the labor market. And I was writing this book actually beginning of the pandemic, early days, or right after, started to write basically right after the pandemic on the 2021. And it was really interesting because this was and we'll talk more about this is one of the more remarkable episodes in the labor market that really highlighted a lot of things that I was actually talking about in the book. Of course, it did it in a very messy way because there are lots of things happening during this time, but it made for a very interesting process where I felt like I was writing the book and the world was writing itself outside, and which was both exciting and challenging.
Okay, so I've said that labor economics has been revelatory, and there's been, if you go back, when I was not young but younger, and I think most economists circa 1990 would have thought of the labor market as just being a market, supply and demand, and where they cross determines wages, and there's nothing much you can do about it. And if you try to change it, you do so at your peril. Bad things will happen. And so you talk in the book, and of course, in many of your writings, and I've been, following all this stuff. That's something that really, really changed. You want to talk about, I think there's a couple of elements. So tell me, how would you describe what happened?
Yeah. So, one really interesting thing is to think about, well, how are wages set? And we could start with the basic supply and demand story, which basically is that there's demand for workers of different skills, and then there's supply. And depending on the supply and demand conditions, you're going to have a different wage as a different skill price. And let me be clear, I think there's a lot of important aspects of, of that actually matter, but it's also incomplete. Because here's the thing, if the market really worked like the textbook supply and demand story, basically workers of a particular type would just get paid the same. That's the skill price. But in reality, it turns out companies have a substantial degree of discretion in setting pay. And you can start to see this, but by just looking across companies hiring similar workers, but choosing to pay somewhat different. So one example that just a really simple example to start with is FedEx and UPS. Workers maybe driving very similar routes, delivering similar packages, but it turns out FedEx pays lower than UPS. UPS has maybe 37% of the workers in a few years back, they were paying less than $20 an hour. For FedEx, it was more like 60%. And so, of course, that's one example, but you have others like look at Walmart versus Target. Turns out that Walmart tends to be paying somewhat lower than many of its other similar large retail competitors. And the list goes on, but this is not a new observation. People who were actually studying this, labor economists in the mid 20th century, had sort of gone and collected surveys and understood that factories across the same in the same labor market could be paying different wages. But here's what was not fully convincing. How do we know that it's not maybe somewhat different skill mix?
Right.
Maybe these companies, they're similar, but they're hiring somewhat different types of workers. And that's really the pay difference that's what it reflects. So that argument held sway for decades and until we had better data. And this is where I think what you say about the labor economics, I think really is right. And part of that has been our ability to really get much more granular and high quality data, including administrative data linking pay for virtually most people in the labor market. And you can track them as they go from company to company. So you could say, hey, actually, what happens if the same person moves from Target or from Walmart to Target? Do you see them getting a higher pay because you're holding their skill set constant there? And so this kind of data and this sort of research design helped establish like, hey, actually, no, it turns out there is a substantial amount of variation in pay that comes across, companies choosing different types of pay policies. And that's a big part of the argument in my book more broadly, that there are choices we have made. If we wanted to go back and look to see what's happened to productivity and what's happened to wages, since 1980, productivity has grown much more strongly than wages. Maybe not as strong as it did in the post-war era, but nonetheless, it grew a lot more than the pay for the typical worker, certainly pay for those at the bottom. And one of the arguments that I make is that this reflects choices made in a variety of places. And that starts from choices at a corporate level, different companies choosing different pay policies, all the way to policies that are being made by state and federal government. But the core part of it is like, why does that make any sense? It doesn't make much sense to talk about companies choosing pay policies if the market is just your supply and demand. There's no role for a company's like, oh, are you doing a high wage strategy or a low wage strategy? That's a nonsensical question in a perfectly competitive market, but absolutely sensible question to ask when companies have some degree of wage setting power. Economists have a funny word for this, right? Monopsony, but it's a funny word, but the basic idea is really straightforward. Like that, companies are making a choice there. You could go for a higher wage strategy or you could go for a lower wage strategy. Now, if you're paying lower wages, you are going to have some more people quit and you're going to have a somewhat harder time recruiting new workers. But the key thing is it doesn't mean that if you pay below a hypothetical market wage, everyone bolts, right? So you actually face a meaningful trade-off of exactly how much more to pay or how much less to pay. And different companies end up choosing different amount. And this is also where, and this is even more recent, really in the last 5 to 7 years, we have seen really big increase in research on the topic of monopsony and really better understand exactly how much wage setting power companies have. And it just sort of turns out that if a company is choosing to pay, let's say, 10% lower wage, they're going to have higher quits, but maybe about 14% higher quits. I just finished doing a review for the Journal of Economic Literature, and that's basically sort of like where it sort of lands. And that is just not very sensitive. The quit rate is not super sensitive to wage. So this gives employers a degree of discretion, and they're going to do a couple of things that's important. First, different companies may choose different strategies. That is what creates these differences across companies. And the way companies have made those choices has really been different in the arc of history.
Okay. So that's where actually I came in on this topic, which was classic paper by Claudia Golden and Bob Margo on, I grew up in a world very different from the world you grew up, but one with much more equal wages than we have now. But it turns out that wasn't something that gradually evolved. It happened in a few years, basically during the New Deal and World War II, the Great Compression.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so that's a story that has been told, but I also tell it with sort of again, a labor market focus. But you're absolutely right. And a key part of that was actually creating a set of collective bargaining institutions starting with the National Labor Relations Act. We had a upsurge in union organizing, and I highlight some more recent work that has been really careful to try to actually understand the causal effect of that unionization, for example, on the wage structure. Work by Henry Farber and co-authors that actually really documents this very carefully. And it's not just in the National Labor Relations Act; it's also during the war. And so the Roosevelt administration really, I think, actually helped encourage increased unionization, and that had a lasting impact on pay setting. So this is basically where after the end of the war, we had what sort of was called the Treaty of Detroit, which was the landmark agreement coined by Fortune magazine, the agreement between the United Auto Workers and the big three automakers, and also which spills over into non-union sector and other parts of this economy through this pattern bargaining process. But all of that exactly created something very different than we had early 20th century. And it created basically a set of mechanisms that helped ensure wages stayed relatively well tethered to overall productivity, and wages both at the bottom and the middle stayed tethered to the top. And that was, there were lots of issues. I don't want to romanticize 1950s and early 60s, but when it came to how wages were determined, it just meant you had broader based prosperity.
So there are social institutions that kind of set norms and so that's part of it. That the thing is much more sort of a surface on which you can move back and forth based on institutions. That was one of the lessons I took from the Great Compression, and now you're saying that there's much more of that, and also that you can get away with it. I mean, I would say that if somebody proposed something like what happened during the New Deal and the war, the Wall Street Journal would be running nonstop fire-breathing editorials about how this will destroy the economy and lead to mass unemployment. And your point is that it doesn't because of these because of the kind of range of discretion that companies have in setting wages.
Exactly. And those range of discretions, like, again, in some cases evolved and were forged in the fire of union organizing and militancy in the 30s and 40s. And other times they're ones that come up in era where it's largely non-union workplaces that are expanding. For example, Walmart in the 1980s, and in an era when there's very different ideologies about how businesses should behave. So the entire shareholder, primacy revolution that sort of happens in the 70s and 80s, turns out it actually had a real impact on how wages were set. So I talk about this in the book, research by Daron Acemoglu from MIT and co-authors, find a really interesting fact. So it turns out that actually most businesses are not run by people with a business school degree. I actually didn't know that. But even today, that's actually the case. But the share that actually have a CEO with a business school degree has been rising quite steadily. So what happened, for example, in the 80s or the 90s when a company moved for the first time to a CEO with an MBA? And sometimes it's because maybe the person retired or even died, which sounds kind of grim, but actually makes for a good natural experiment where almost like by random, I just, introduce a CEO with the MBA for the first time. And what's really interesting is that it leads to very clear reduction in pay, about 6% reduction in pay for workers overall, about 9% reduction for blue collar workers. So the labor share falls by about 5 percentage points. So that's the amount of money going to workers versus owners. And of course, CEO pay rises. Now you may say, well, maybe that happens and that's just like the cost of running the business better, right? MBA probably raising productivity. Wrong. It has no effect on productivity compared to comparable businesses. So it's purely a rent transfer, as we say, meaning you're taking money from one group and giving it to the other. In this case, the money is going from owners of capital and high income managers away towards them, away from workers, especially blue collar workers.
Wow, that's I always thought that the Harvard Business School was evil, but I didn't realize it was quite that evil. So that's pretty impressive. That's really a significant impact on sort of the nature of our society that comes from almost an academic doctrine. Uh,
Absolutely. This is sort of the importance sort of like of ideology. It's ideology, not skills, that is explaining this important change here. And in fact, this turns out to have played a non-trivial role in the fall in the labor share in the United States, for example.
that's a really funny thing. I mean, economists are supposed to be hard-headed and it's all, but in fact, if you really look at the data, if you really do economic science, it says that ideology matters a lot.
That's right. So, and that's one of the most important things. So, the late economist Alan Kruger once actually told me, well, he told us on Twitter in a conversation with me that the idea that core theory is falsifiable and testable is a really big idea. And that is exactly right. And because if you start with saying, well, I'm pretty sure the labor market works this way. And then I come and tell you, oh, actually, it turns out this MBA CEO comes in, pay falls. You'd say, well, there's got to be a really good explanation for that, and that is consistent with my model. But it's certainly not because the model is false, because it can't be. And that's basically sort of highlights in some ways the conversations we had about the role of the minimum wage,
Yeah.
which is something we
So
can talk about as well.
I want to come back to wage structure, but I want to talk about Sweden in a bit. But let's talk about that. I mean, this is when I say that labor economics, it is especially good or virtuous or anyways, but something special. There's really this use of natural experiments where something happens and looking at it, and on at least a couple of major occasions, it has really changed. Uh, it has been contradiction to what most economists believed, and this is, and I do want to come back to the wage structure, but minimum wage is the classic, is extraordinary story. You could probably tell it better than I can, but so it's to some extent it's where you came in, but it's definitely where Alan Kruger and David Card came in. So we're going to talk about that.
Yeah. So maybe one thing just as a background for listeners in the United States, of course, introduced a minimum wage as part of the Fair Labor Standards Act in the 1930s. And during the 40s and 50s and 60s and even 70s, the minimum wage was updated fairly regularly. And it was updated. You could have a Republican president or a Democratic president, Congress, but it was generally updated and it kept up with, again, sort of like the typical or the median wage and even overall productivity and so on. That all changed in 1980. And 1980, of course, is when Ronald Reagan, came into power, and he didn't increase the minimum wage. He refused to because he thought this was a bad idea. And this was also a time when, in the early 80s, of course, we had still high inflation. So the combination of the fact that the nominal minimum wage just stayed put and there was inflation meant the actual real value of the minimum wage fell a lot. And so that had a really important impact on wage inequality at the bottom. And it reduced pay for roughly the bottom 30 to 40% even of the workforce. And we went for basically a decade almost at this time without raising the minimum wage. And this sort of began, like we have now sort of had several of these long stretches. The most recent one is particularly long. It's 17 years since we have actually raised the minimum wage. And so that's a very dysfunctional way to set policy. But here's, of course, the silver lining. The silver lining of dysfunctional policies that you have natural experiments.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was going to say, so what happened starting in the 80s is that states started to come in and really raised, their minimum wage. And so you start to create all of these little natural experiments. And this is really what began this literature. It's called the new minimum wage literature, which just sort of started to look to see, hey, New Jersey raised its minimum wage in 1992. But look, neighboring Pennsylvania did not. Well, Eastern Pennsylvania and New Jersey are not super different. They're right next to each other. There's a lot of similarities, maybe sharing similar type of economic shocks and so forth. Why don't we compare to see what happened? And this is exactly what Alan Kruger and David Card did. And, they went and surveyed restaurants, fast food restaurants on both sides of the state border, and then they went back, a year later and said, well, let's take a look. What happened? Did we actually see lower number of jobs in New Jersey? And what they found really shocked the profession. That turns out not so much. In fact, not really anything we can see. And, this was really kind of a earth-shattering discovery because it challenged the core model of the labor market. The labor market's supply and demand. That's it. There's not much more to it, just like any other market. And this was really hard to square with it. And I think this led to kind of a emergence of a whole literature that there's a lot of very critical and, not very polite sometimes things said about Card and Kruger. But, it led to a lot of debate and also follow-up work, which is the way sort of science progresses. If it's
Yeah,
doing.
the result has been replicated now many times. You've done a fair bit of that, but they're just because there are so many states and so much
Exactly.
asynchronous minimum wage increases that you get, and and their result, which was just you say, oh, fast food workers in New Jersey, but it turns out that we have now lots and lots of evidence that says, hey, these minimum wage hikes do not actually seem to cost jobs, or at least not significantly, right? Is that?
Yeah, yeah. So I think that, in many ways, sort of my sort of contribution to the literature in our 2010 paper could be probably summarized by the word many. We did many of these, and for many years, not just one, one short impact. And what we found was very much along the lines of what Carter and Kruger had found. And even more recently, we updated that with, some even more data, and continuing to find very similar effects. In fact, just a few, well, like a couple weeks ago, I put out a Substack post that really sort of leverages, in some ways, an important fact related to what I said, that we've not raised the federal minimum wage for 17 years.
Right.
And that means 20 states have today a $7.25 an hour minimum wage, which is sort of economically, it's equivalent to not having any minimum wage.
Right.
We get
So
7.25
low.
so low that it barely affects anyone. So we're running this basically more than a generation long experiment where you have about half the country, a little less than half the country, with essentially no minimum wage, and the other half raised it quite sometimes substantially, or comparable to some of our European peer countries. And that creates this very sharp divide, but it also creates a divide that makes it very easy to see what is going on, because you don't have to do a lot of fancy econometrics, statistics to really tell. Just plot, for example, as I do, what's the restaurant wage in these two groups of states? Well, it turns out there's a big gap that's opened up, like maybe 8-9% average earnings gap for restaurant workers. What happened to restaurant employment? It looks pretty much like a flat line. They've been growing very similarly. Per capita restaurant employment has been very similar. And that just makes it very hard to look at that very simple fact and say, no, I'm pretty sure it's killing a lot of jobs, because where is it? So that's, I sort of do a bunch of other things, but this sort of highlights in this period where we're going for a very long stretch of time where basically we've like split the country in some ways in half. And by the way, some of these states that have raised the minimum wage have also been more Republican leaning. A lot of times when the minimum wage is on the ballot, including in red and purple states, it passed. Not always. Just in fact, this week in Oklahoma, for a variety of reasons, it didn't pass, but it has passed in Nebraska, Florida, Arizona, and so on and so forth. So I think this sort of highlights, in some ways, one of the partial successes and it's a partial because we have been able to raise the minimum wage in about half the country, and as we have learned more, I think it led to policymakers, actually experimenting with potentially higher minimum wages, and that has, I think, helped create and raise wages at the bottom. Partly offsetting the growth and inequality that had occurred over decades after
Yeah.
1980.
So I read that Substack post, and I noticed that you had some, I would say, discreetly acerbic comments on some of the people who refused to believe it, or maybe it was a later comment of yours. So there has always been some economists who keep on insisting that this cannot be right. And either because I believe in Econ 101 and demand curves slope down, or at least implicitly a little bit of a political critique, because obviously a pro minimum wage, or something that seems to say that raising the minimum wage is okay, has got a political side. But what I think looking at that is that what's actually striking is how little of that there is. That labor economics makes economics look good, in the sense that if you have kind of overwhelming empirical evidence that contradicts people's preconceptions and maybe even their political slant, that people actually mostly go with the evidence. Am I being too
I
idealistic?
think that's generally right. I think in general, people have certainly updated their views. And again, it's not that there's only a single answer and what does the minimum wage do, regardless of how high it is or something like that. It's going to differ, and so there's disagreements, for example, on well, where's the turning point and so forth. But that's part of good science. Now, but there is, to be clear, still there will be studies that claim that no, actually, the minimum wage has always caused job losses. And even just this week, there was one that sort of argued that, in fact, it turns out, it turns out that if you not control for population differences, if you just look at the number of jobs, well, the number of jobs in California has grown less than Texas. Most economists, of course, look at what share of workers, what share of people are actually working. That's the employment rate. But if you simply look at the number of jobs, it actually might suggest that it's falling. Now, here's the thing. It has been falling in these minimum wage raised states compared to these other, let's say, the 20 states that haven't, for 4.5 decades, and largely driven by college-educated workers, because, of course, we have more college-educated workers moving to the Sun Belt. So, this is sort of, I think, kind of a silly argument, but it is an argument that has been made. But that goes to show there will be always studies. But if you look at the body of evidence overall, it suggests that the typical study finds very small employment effects, and especially ones that are published in the last 10 years, it's basically around zero. And I think that has had an impact. And I think economists have sort of updated. I would say probably especially younger scholars. Sometimes, as we get older, maybe maybe it becomes harder for some of us to revise our priors. But younger scholars, that's why really important.
Yeah, I occasionally find people, dig up some old quote of mine where I said minimum wages reduce employment, and then it's a 30 or 35-year-old quote, and I get to use the line, when I see new evidence, I change my mind. What do you do?
Exactly.
And there was a flurry of stuff showing up in my inbox claiming that, oh, California raised the minimum wage and it's a disaster, and it's that the evidence is in. And but I guess the evidence actually goes the other way now, right? Is that what happened in California?
Yeah. So here's the interesting thing. California established a sector-wide minimum wage for the fast food workers, higher than the overall minimum wage. So this is a case where this is applying for larger chains with 60 or more locations across the country to have a $20 minimum wage. And that's higher than at that time, I think it was 16 overall in California. So what's interesting is this is much higher, and it's also partial coverage. So meaning, only part of the low wage workforce is covered. So you could actually imagine there'd be more theoretical reasons to expect a more, negative employment effect, because you can switch, maybe you can relabel workers who are delivery workers as, like outsourced and so forth, and not be covered. So anyway, well, you've now had like about 5 studies that have looked at it, including one that I did. And, there's some differences across the studies, but really it turns out a big part of that is what kind of data is used in a really surprising way. So there are 2 kind of administrative data sources that are really government data counting based on actual payroll records, the QCW and the QWI. And I know this is going into weeds here, but it just turns out one captures better what's the number of jobs at a point in time, and then the other looks at how many people are in a particular pay period. Now, this increase in wage also raised turnover, because these are much better jobs now. So you have less people cycling through the same number of positions. And so this one data set that looks at a whole pay period seems to find a small reduction in employment. The other point in time, no change. And it turns out that is just driven by the fact that these jobs became so much better, people are not quitting. And so they're just a lot lower turnover. But generally speaking, the overall range suggests that the employment effects were quite small, small positive in some cases, small negative, depending on exactly how you do it, very large wage effects and very sharp reduction in turnover. So even in this very specific and very sharp and high minimum wage increase, as sort of an experiment, if you will, it doesn't show in any of the sort of like very clear predictions and projections about job losses so far.
Okay, I want to cycle back just for a couple of minutes to the wage structure issue, where again, there's this kind of historical story which says that the United States became relatively egalitarian uh, because of New Deal era 1940s, actually, especially policies, and then became a lot less equal. It's funny, I always blamed what happened after 1980 on Ronald Reagan, but you're saying it's partly the Harvard Business School. But but the but there's also cross-national comparisons, and where uh, talk to me about Sweden, and then maybe I'll weigh in
Yeah.
on that a
So I
bit.
think we've been writing about Europe, and I think we're both visiting there. So I was in Sweden for a while, and partly talking about this book and also some of my research. What's really interesting is Sweden, of course, has been historically held up as sort of like an egalitarian country, but it's also gone through quite a bit of reforms in the 90s and 2000s, including scaling back partly some of the welfare state. And so I was really curious, like, well, where are they in terms of where inequality is? And it turns out that, yeah, if you look at their tax and transfer, they actually redistribute less than they used to. But the starting point, which is how much inequality do you have to begin with from the pay structure, that is still much lower than pretty much most other high income countries, and United States, of course, is the other extreme. And so just like one example, like the gap between someone at the 90th percentile and the 10th percentile, that kind of is a good measure of wage inequality. Between like the early 90s and today, it went maybe from 1.8 in Sweden to 2.2, a little bit increase. In the US, starting off much higher to begin with, went from like 3.7 to 4.8. And it actually, the increase is even more if you look at a broader time horizon. So it's just a really important thing to understand. Like, why is that? And this is, again, we go back to like, well, is it because like the Swedes are just a lot more similarly skilled between each
Right.
other? Because that would have to be the reason, or is there something else? It turns out it's mostly something else. And that has to do with collective bargaining. And this is also a really important aspect and where people don't fully also appreciate one really interesting and important fact, which is that in the United States, when we say, "Oh, is your job covered by union contract?" that question is almost the same as asking, "Are you a union member?" And of course, union membership in the US, maybe in the private sector, having something like 35% back in the 50s, is today like 6%. And so barely anyone overall, like very few people in the country overall are covered in the private sector, are covered by union contract there. But here's the interesting thing. If you went to France and asked what share of the workforce are union members, overall it's like 10%. But 98% of jobs are covered by union contract, because
Right.
what you have is sectoral bargaining. And this is a key thing which I talk about in the book. Is sectoral bargaining was something that the US never really had. We basically had organizing and negotiating between the union and the employer at the company by company, sometimes store by store or factory by factory level. Versus in a lot of our peer economies, what happens is workers and their representatives bargain with employer and their representative at sort of a sectoral level at a national
Means
setting.
basic sectoral level means that instead of getting a wage agreement with XYZ contractors, you got a wage agreement with the whole, I don't know, uh,
Construction or
construction
yeah.
industry, and so even workers who are not members of unions, even workers who are at companies that have hardly any union members, get the benefit of the negotiation.
Exactly. And so, Sweden's an interesting case where they actually have high union membership.
Yeah.
That's an interesting reason, and Nordic countries generally, partly because of the way unions help indirectly help provide some additional benefits, including unemployment benefits, and that makes it more rewarding to actually join a union. But their coverage rate is even higher. And countries, for example, like France or Austria, the coverage rates are substantially higher. So as a result, we've seen wage inequality not rise as much in a lot of other countries. And in Sweden, it's actually been particularly low, and they've actually been able to retain it. And so that is a really important contrast. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is that, we can't get to sectoral bargaining at the national level without substantial change in labor law.
Right.
And look, the reality is that past attempts at reforming labor law has not fared well. But the good news is that we can actually get to pay standards using at the industry or sector level by state. And what's even more interesting is we actually have started to see some of this already. And this really leans on a model that actually now comes from a different continent, Australia. And Australia has basically a national level setting of wage floors by industries and within industries by different types of jobs. And that's done not through collective bargaining. They have collective bargaining on top of that, but this is basically a sector-wide floor that's set. And again, Australia has lower wage inequality, substantially lower than the United States. So I talk about what that world might look like if we had states do something similar. And, like I said, when I was starting to write this book in 2021, I actually had put out a sort of a proposal back in 2019. But in the last 5 years, we have a number of states that have started to implement some of this. Like, for example, Minnesota has a sector-wide board that has representatives from workers and employers and the government to set pay for in the nursing home sector. We have California that has a healthcare-wide minimum wage. We even more recently in the state of Washington have a child care sector board that will be in coming months issuing a set of wage floors in that sector. So we're starting to see experimentation like this, and that's important because if we're trying to rebuild wages, not just at the very bottom that the minimum wage can really hit, but also those towards the middle, especially in this, childcare or healthcare sector, these jobs, you can actually raise pay there, through these sectoral initiatives. And I'm very, excited to see more being done along this, especially because, I don't know what can be done in Washington, D.C. right now, but, we don't have to necessarily wait around for a better day to come in D.C. We can actually start doing some of this now, more
So
locally.
it's like minimum wages, where sort of half the states can do a lot on this broader issue of a more equal and better wage structure, even if things are totally stymied in Washington.
That's right. And, and that's one of the nice things about the US, of course, federalism, right? Like that we do actually experiment at the state level. And sometimes, in the best cases, some of the better experiments actually get adopted. It could be also not so great experiments are done and get adopted, but that's the nature of democracy.
Yeah, one of the areas where you really did a lot of the research, and it was revelatory, but also in a weird way, something where I found a lot of my sort of lefty friends not willing to believe it was about wages, sort of post-COVID. So let's talk about that for a second. What happened? And
Yeah. So, around 2021, 2022, of course, I look at wages, like I'm a labor economist, and, I started to look around and find something that was puzzling. Because, of course, we've known for a long time, wages have been rising faster at the top than the middle than the bottom. And this is the growing wage inequality story. But it was looking like wages right after COVID when we're reopening. This was also a time of, a lot of people didn't have jobs because especially in the hospitality sector, we'd sort of shut down part of the economy. So, if you had sort of asked me, like, it's January 2020, and I come and say, I will tell you something. We are going to shut down some part of the economy, especially with low wage workers for a while, and then we're going to reopen. Here's your quiz if I could give it in my class. Like, what do you think? What's your prediction about what will happen to wages for low wage workers? I would have said, well, probably fall, lower demand, and instead, it looked like wages are rising more at the bottom. And so this is what David Otter, my co-author in this, along with Annie McGrew and I, call the unexpected compression, where the compression means compressing wages, reducing inequality, which is exactly what happened in the aftermath of the reopening after COVID, and led to sort of surprising amount of wage growth at the bottom. And it reduced maybe between, like maybe a quarter to a third of the increase in wage inequality that had occurred between 1980 and 2019. And so this was really, very, very striking. And what we tried to do is to try to say, well, why? And the reason is because we had a very tight labor market. We had a very tight labor market, meaning there were a lot of job openings chasing workers. And as a result, it increased workers' leverage. And it's not just that there was more demand for workers, that's true, but we also saw people leaving jobs. So we had quits from particularly low paid jobs. This goes back to the issue of different companies with different pay policies. Well, companies that were actually going for a low wage strategy found it harder to hold on to those workers, and wages actually then rose more there. And this is the increasing of intensification of competition in the labor market that actually really helped boost wages. So in many ways, this was like, if we want the market to actually work well for workers, you need the market to be relatively tight. And in writing the book, what I've sort of found was like, if it just turns out like there were about between 1980 and 2019, before the pandemic, there were about 7 years of tight labor market. We used to spend a lot more time with tight labor markets in the post-war era before 1980 than we did since. And this turns out to be another important part of that equation of why, what does it take to have broad-based wage growth? Those 7 years, if I just like snap my finger and just erase those like some evil genius villain, well, if I went to the top of the pay distribution, it would make very little impact. The average wage growth would fall from 1.1 to 1%. Not much change. At the bottom, it would go from already a small 0.3% average real wage growth to zero. So the entirety of the wage growth at the bottom in this between 1980 and 2019 happened in a handful of years that was basically close to full employment. The late 1990s and the late 2010s under Trump. Trump won. And those years also saw significant compression. And this is why, the post-pandemic period was a really important one, but it's also very messy because, as we know, this was also a time of large increase in inflation, a chunk of which was, by the way, global in nature. But nonetheless, people were very unreasonably unhappy about it. So it makes it a difficult thing to extract the signal from noise. And this is why in the book, I really highlight also why even these other periods, right, in US history were so important in actually raising wages, highlighting really the critical pillar that full employment plays if we are trying to rebuild the wage standard.
Okay, what do you see happening now? I mean, my comments and feeds are full of, oh, it's a K-shaped economy, and but also, of course, fears. The top is rising, the bottom is falling, but always was. That's part of that thing. People really refuse to admit that the compression ever happened, but but also all these fears about AI and all. I know everybody wants to know what AI is going to do, and nobody can honestly say that they know. But do you have any views on where we're going right now?
Yeah, so the easiest part of that to answer is just to start with wages. And what we see is, the good news is that much of the compression that we saw has remained. The bad news is that the last year and a half has seen some take back. So basically, we have seen lower wage growth at the very bottom. The particularly bad news is, of course, from this year, which is just that higher inflation has erased, as of now, pretty much entirety of the real wage growth since Donald Trump took office. And so that's really bad. That's just not just at the bottom, but just generally. And so I think wages are not doing great right now. And that's largely, that part is largely just an unforced error of where we are today with having raised inflation, literally having caused a supply shock inflation purely out of discretion,
Right.
which is, yeah. The other part, and that this is the more longer part and harder to say, is where we see with sort of the not within pay, not wage inequality. Wage inequality has been an important part of inequality overall in the last 50 years, but wealth and the division between capital and labor. And that's where, looking into the future, where my worries lie is where are we going? And, and I guess like the worrisome part of me thinks that there are sort of broadly, I see two possible ways that the current AI structure can go. My modal view is probably that I think it's going to lead to moderate productivity gains, and how well that translates into wage growth partly actually depends on what we do in our other policy and institutional choices. But I think it can potentially be a source of possible wage growth. The other is, of course, they're two very polar cases. Like, well, this is going to be the singularity. I tend to be skeptical of that view of a AGI that really just dramatically transforms the world as we know it. It's possible. Anything is possible. But the other possibility is that actually there's a bubble and then it bursts and then it leads to a downturn, and that downturn could be harmful. And I think so. There are all of these possibilities that I think that I of course don't know where it might be, but there are risks in both ends. Where what I do know is, and this is what I sort of talk a little bit about in the book, is that again, it goes back to the word choices, that I don't think we need to think about what AI does as something that just happens to us. We can choose to have institutions and governance structure that can regulate that. What's interesting, in going back to Sweden, I was talking to folks in the labor movement there, and they, of course, have contractual language that requires negotiations over technology, and that includes AI. Where that goes, it's unclear at this time. It's still early days, but that's the kind of thing that we need to think about. So imagine having sectoral boards in healthcare sector that, amongst other things, also sort of has regulatory language around how AI is used and how it can affect workforce. So we need to think creatively, of course, at the national level, but even more locally, if necessary, about what that governance looks like, and understanding that this is part of the choice that we can make, and not simply, take the technology as just, force of nature that we just have to live with.
Okay, so choices. We can actually shape our future, and probably won't. But anyway, sorry. Gallows humor gets me through the day. Thanks so much for talking to me, and I'm sure we'll want to come back in a couple of years and see how all of this played out.
Sounds great. Great
Take
talking to you,
care.
Paul.